Okay, chapter 21. Minley and the buffalo boy pushed through the crowd as the sun burned the tops of their heads. Minley, used to the spare harvest of her village, couldn't help gaping at the tall mounds of food for sale at the market of green abundance. The street and open courtyard were filled with umbrella-covered stalls and stands, flaunting jade-colored cabbages, curled cucumbers, purple eggplants, and tangy oranges. Glossy sugared hawthorn berries, like rubies on a stick, made Minley's mouth water. I don't see the king anywhere, Minley said. Well, maybe he's not here yet, the buffalo boy said. I don't know if I'll find him here, Minley said. Now in the daylight, the buffalo boy's friend didn't seem as extraordinary. What would the king be doing at a street market anyway? She said he'd be here, so he will, the buffalo boy said, his mouth making a stubborn line. Hey, get away from that, a vendor yelled as the buffalo attempted to eat frosty green lettuce. The buffalo boy quickly pulled him away. Get your buffalo out of here, the vendor shouted, as red-faced as the radishes he was selling. I better take him away, the buffalo boy said, pulling the buffalo's head away from the arrays of tempting food. He's hungry. I should take him to pasture. I'll stay here, Minley said. You don't need to look for the king with me. Okay, the boy said. If you need a place to stay tonight, you know where my hut is. If not, maybe I'll see you around. Good luck. Thanks, Minley said, but as he carelessly waved goodbye, she realized that she might not see him again. Before he disappeared from sight, she grabbed the last coin out of her bag and ran to him. Wait, Minley said. Here, take this. No, the boy laughed. I don't need that. You keep it. But Minley started, but he had already turned around. Goodbye, she heard him call, and the buffalo snorted a farewell as well. Minley smiled wryly to herself. Now what? Minley thought as she wandered past stalls, weaving around merchants and customers. How am I supposed to find the king here? Please spare a piece of fruit for an old man, a voice creaked. Minley turned around and saw a wrinkled, poor man begging at a peach stand. He was dirty and bent, and his clothes looked as if they were made from rags used to wash floors. Please, he begged the peach vendor, I'm so thirsty. One small peach, your smallest. Go away, old man, the fat vendor said. No money, no peach. Please, the beggar said again weakly. Pity a tired old man. Get away from here, you worthless beggar, the vendor spat out, or I'll call the guards on you. The vendor's loud voice had attracted attention from passers-by, and a small crowd began to form in front of the peach stand. It's disgraceful to treat an old man like that, someone murmured. Just give him a peach. All of you are so generous with my property, the vendor glared at the crowd. If you care so much, buy him a peach. As Minnie watched the beggar's hand outstretched and shaking with hunger, she felt a sharp pang inside her. It reminded her of Ba, reaching out with his last chopstick of rice for her fish. The copper coin she had offered the buffalo boy was warm in her hand. She could almost feel her heart beating against its round edges. Here, she said, handing the vendor the coin. Then she picked the largest peach on the stand and handed it to the old man. He bowed to her gracefully and eagerly ate the peach. Forgetting about the inner city and the palace for the moment, Minley watched him. In fact, as if under a spell, the whole crowd stood and watched him swallow the fruit until he held a peach pit in his hand. Thank you, the beggar said in a much stronger voice, and he bowed to the onlooking people. The peach was so delicious. I wish for all of you to be able to taste it. If you would humor an old man and stay a little while, I'll share my good fortune. The old man took a small stick out of his pocket and bent down. In the dirt next to the black bricks, he dug a small hole and planted his peach pit. He stuck his stick upright in the little mound and then asked for water. Minley, now completely fascinated, took out her water jug and handed it to him. As he poured water onto his stick, it trembled, and was she imagining it? It seemed to grow. And it was growing. The stick grew higher and higher and thicker until it was the width of Minley's arm. She could no longer see the top of it. Pink flowers and branches began to blossom out of it. As the sweet scents of flowers filled the air, Minley realized the stick had become a peach tree. The crowd of people seemed to realize this too, as they all gaped at it open-mouthed. Even the stingy vendor left his fruit stand to stare at it in awe. Like pink snow, the petals fell from the tree and made a soft carpet on the dirt. Green leaves sprouted, and as they cascaded over the branches, pale moon-colored balls, like pearls, developed, almost as if they were small balloons being blown with air. They grew into round fruit, blushing pink and red as they developed. Soon the tree was heavy with them, and the air was full of the enchanted smell of ripe peaches. Children gathered around and stared longingly at the luscious fruit, while the adults gulped with their mouths watering. Finally, the old man reached up, plucked a peach from the tree, and handed it to one of the people in the crowd. Please, he said, waving his hand, help yourself. The crowd needed no other urging. Young children climbed the tree, passing down the fruit, while the taller adults simply stretched and grabbed. A boy with a tired horse climbed onto its back and reached an especially red peach that called to him. Before long, everyone's mouths were full of sweet, soft peach flesh and groans of delight. Even the peach vendor, his stand forgotten, stood under the tree with his eyes closed contentedly and peach juice dribbling out of his mouth. Min Lee, however, didn't join in the feast of peaches. If I hadn't been eating peaches all the way to the city, Min Lee said to herself, I'd be the first one climbing the tree. But as she was slightly tired of peaches, Min Lee saw that no one else did. She noticed that every time someone plucked a peach from the tree, a peach from the fruit stand disappeared. The beggar is using the vendor's peaches for his tree, Min Lee laughed to herself as she glanced at him through the fruit-eating crowd. He was watching with an amused look, and suddenly Min Lee saw that the beggar wasn't really that old at all. He must be a magician. Maybe he can help me get into the inner city. Min Lee edged toward him. As she weaved her way to him, the last peach was picked from the tree, and the leaves and branches began to disappear. The tree trunk seemed to shrivel in itself, and it grew thinner and shorter. The crowd had finished their peaches, and the ground was littered with peach pits. When Min Lee finally reached the beggar, the tiny twig of the tree vanished underneath the pile of peach pits, and the beggar was turning to leave. Wait, Min Lee said, and grabbed his arm. However, as Min Lee took hold of his sleeve, it pulled back, and a glint of gold shone. Hastily, the beggar pushed back his sleeve, but the quick glance was enough for Min Lee to see that he wore a gold bracelet in the shape of a dragon. They stared at each other as Min Lee's quick-thinking mind somersaulted. Only the imperial family is allowed to use the image of a dragon, Dragon had said. Everyone knows a golden dragon is always and only worn by kings, said the buffalo boy. The words flashed in her mind, and Min Lee could scarcely breathe. You're wearing a dragon, Min Lee gasped. Only the is allowed to wear a golden... You must be... Where's that beggar? A loud, angry shout cut through the chaos. Min Lee recognized the vendor's voice. He stole my peaches. I'll get him. Quickly, the beggar shook off Min Lee from his arm and began to run. She stared in shock as she finished her sentence. You must be, Min Lee whispered to the ragged, disappearing figure, the king. Chapter 22. Min Lee shook herself from her shock. The king, Min Lee said. I can't lose him now. And in a panic, she began to run after the tattered figure. And it was quite a chase, or it would have been if the beggar had realized he was being followed. He wove in and out around people in bins of rice, each step taking them closer to the unused areas of the city. Behind a pile of discarded baskets, Min Lee thought she had lost him, but luckily the gray sleeve of his loose jacket waved at her, and she saw him round the walled corner of the inner city. As an abandoned wagon hid her from his view, she saw him push against a portion of the wall. With a slow groan, the wall moved. It was a secret door to the inner city, Min Lee gasped, and she was able to reach it just before it closed completely. With both hands, she pressed hard against it, and the door pushed open. And like a lid of a jewelry box, the door opened into a landscape of radiant colors. The bamboo, pine, and plum leaves seemed to shine in the sun, as if carved from emeralds, and the accents of the pink and red flowers were like nestled rubies. Steps away from her feet, Min Lee could see a patterned pathway made of water-worn pebbles. The central jade-green lake mirrored the arching tiled roofs of the pavilions and the rough beauty of large, weathered rock sculptures. A winding, covered walkway lifted up from the cloudy water like a lotus flower. It could only be the palace garden. But Min Lee barely noticed this. Instead, she stood with large eyes, staring at the figure in front of her. The beggar was wiping his face with a delicate white cloth, and Min Lee saw again that it was not an old man at all. In fact, he was younger than Ba. The gray of his hair was wiped away with the cloth as well, and his beard and head were as glossy black as Min Lee's. His gray rags had been cast off in a pile next to him, and he was clothed in a bright yellow silk, the color of the sun. Intricate dragons and multicolored clouds that matched the designs of the gold bracelet he wore were embroidered on his robes and glittered in the light. There was no doubt now that he was the king. Then the king turned around and saw her. At his glance, Min Lee shrank to the ground in a humble kowtow. Your Majesty, Min Lee breathed, and her knees could feel the thumping of her heart in her chest. Caught, Min Lee heard him say, and she peeked up to see the king looking at her with that same amused expression he'd had as a beggar watching the people eat the peaches. He shook his head at her, with his eyes twinkling at her. He could have been the young father of one of her village friends. And by you, he said, my little benefactor, I knew you were a clever one. Your Majesty, a chorus of voices came through the air toward them, and Min Lee could see a parade of servants in the distance running across the zigzagged bridge. Well, you mustn't be caught by them, the king said to Min Lee. Then they will find out all about my little adventures, and then where will I be? And he pulled Minley up to her feet and pushed her behind one of the giant gnarled stone carvings, kicking his rags over her. Quickly, quickly, he said, and don't say a word. I command you not to say a word or to come out until I say so. Minley clutched the rough stone and made herself as small as possible. Hundreds of footsteps were approaching like falling rain from a thunderstorm. What is this? The king demanded. Has war been declared on the city? Your Majesty, an out-of-breath voice said. We've been searching for you. Searching for me, the king said. I've been here in the garden for hours. We must have missed you, the voice stuttered. No one could find you. The guard had not seen you, and we feared. You feared the king of the city of bright moonlight had been spirited away, the king laughed. Not this time, Counselor Chu. However, I do feel the wish to commune with the moon tonight. Your Majesty, the voice said. Yes, the king said decisively. Tonight, I wish to be alone in the garden with the moon. Have a meal brought to me and then clasping the moon pavilion, and do not disturb me until morning. Yes, Your Majesty, the voice said, and Minley couldn't help but peek out. She saw rows and rows of finely dressed people kneeling with their heads on the ground in front of the king. Their rich silk clothing shimmered in the fading sunlight. One man dressed in black kneeled closer to the king, separated from the rest of the courtiers. Minley guessed he was Counselor Chu. Actually, bring me 2 meals, the king said, and glanced toward Minley. She caught his eye and quickly shrank back out of sight. 2 meals, Your Majesty, Counselor Chu asked with just the faintest question in his voice. Yes, 2 meals, the king said. I shall honor the spirit of the moon with her own meal. Since she will be keeping me company, it is only fair. Yes, Your Majesty, the counselor said. Minley could only guess how puzzled he was, but he was well trained enough to keep it out of his voice. In an hour's time, the king said, I shall be at the Clasping the Moon Pavilion. I want the food waiting for me and nothing else. I do not wish to be disturbed by anyone this evening. Yes, Your Majesty, the voice said again, and Minley could hear the shuffling and swishing of silk as the group rose and took leave of the king. They've gone, the king said in a low voice. You can come out now. Minley crawled out from behind the sculpture. Well, my little friend, he said to her, now that you know who I am, come walk with me and tell me who you are. Chapter 23. Minley and the king walked through the garden, and she told him her name and where she was from and about her journey. Remembering the fish's warning, she carefully didn't mention dragon waiting for her in the forest. As they walked, the patterned stone pathways gently massaged her feet, and the sun seemed to disappear like a closing flower. When they finally approached the pavilion, night had fallen. So the king said, now you have come here to find the guardian of the city. Yes, Minley said, and looked at him expectantly. And you think the guardian is me, the king said. Yes, Minley said. Do you know what the borrowed line is? May I have it? The borrowed line, the king repeated, and they stopped in front of the pavilion. The moon's reflection fastened under the water's surface, and Minley saw why the pavilion was called the Clasping the Moon. The image of the moon lay protected in the water like a glowing pearl, and the king stared at it deep in thought. Come, let's eat, and then we'll see what can be done about your borrowed line. Minley entered the open-air pavilion. At the center, 2 stools and a small table of elaborately carved ginkgo wood waited for them. A large, finely woven bamboo basket, as tall as Minley's waist, stood next to the chairs. The king eagerly lifted off its lid, and rich, warm aromas floated in the air, making Minley's stomach grumble. The king took out the plates of delicate pink shrimp, dumplings, savory noodles, and pork, dragon's beard bean sprouts, emerald green chives, and a bowl of white jade tofu soup. A pot of tea and an assortment of cakes sat on the bottom layer of the basket to finish off the dinner. The king handed Minley a pair of intricate gold chopsticks that weighed heavily in her hands, and with his urging, Minley began to eat what was easily the most delicious meal she had ever had. I'm not sure what the borrowed line is that you were looking for, the king told Minley as he sipped his tea. They had finished eating the main meal, and she was enjoying a turtle-shaped cake filled with sweet and soft red bean paste, a taste not known to her before. As she swallowed, its richness seemed to warm her from her throat to her stomach, but I think I can guess. With great effort, Minley stopped eating and looked at him. You can, she asked, and suddenly a hope filled her. What do you think it is? Do you know why this city is called the City of Bright Moonlight, the king asked. Minley shook her head. My great-great-grandfather changed the name of this city. It used to be called the City of the Far Remote. But after he came to power, he changed it to the City of Bright Moonlight, the king said. Most people thought it was because he had a poetic heart, but it was more than that. Have you heard the story of the magistrate that tried to outwit the old man of the moon? Minley nodded. He tried to kill his son's destined wife, but they ended up together anyway. Ah, you know the story, the king smiled. That magistrate was my great-great-grandfather's father, and this city is a city that his son became king of through the marriage. So the story is real, Min Li said. Well, it's a story that has been passed through my family for generations, the king said, but there's more to it than what most have heard. The unknown part of the story of the old man of the moon. After the old man of the moon told the magistrate his son would marry the daughter of a grocer, Magistrate Tiger flew into a rage. With both hands, he grabbed the page and tore it from the book. Before he could rip the page in two, the old man's eyes stared into his, and the light of the moon seemed to bind the magistrate still. As the silence hung in the air, Magistrate Tiger's anger turned to fear. But finally, the old man of the moon nodded at him grimly. Pages of the Book of Fortune do not tear easily, but that paper was being sent to you before I borrowed it, the old man said. So perhaps it is only fitting that you finally receive it. Take it. The book has bestowed some extra qualities to it. They will be as useless to you as the original paper would have been. Without another word, the old man of the moon stood up and walked away up the mountain. The magistrate could do nothing but stare, clutching the ripped paper in dumbfounded silence. He tore a page out of the Book of Fortune, Min Li said. Yes, the king said, but he himself was never able to read it, so it remained useless to him just as the old man of the moon had said it would be. Come, the king said, as he walked out of the pavilion onto the bridge under the moon. As Min Li followed, he reached inside the breast of a shirt, slowly took out a gold-threaded pouch, and he said, This is the ripped page. It has been passed down from generation to generation, studied by the kings of the city of bright moonlight. None of us has ever understood what the old man of the moon meant when he said it was borrowed. Min Li watched, fascinated, as the king took from the gold pouch a delicate folded piece of paper. Paler than even the white jade tofu she had eaten for dinner, the paper seemed to have a light of its own, dimming the gold threads of the pouch that held it. It was my great-great-grandfather, the king said, unfolding the paper, who realized that the words on it can only be seen in the bright moonlight. He renamed the city of bright moonlight as a reminder for the kings that followed him. Min Li looked at the paper as if in a daze. In the moonlight, the page glowed. A single line of faint words, as if written with shadows, was scrawled upon the page in a language Min Li had never seen. So I think this paper, which the old man of the moon said he borrowed, the king said, this written line, torn from the Book of Fortune, is the borrowed line you seek. Of course, Min Li said, and excitement bubbled inside of her. It must be. But her excitement popped as she looked at the carefully preserved page and remembered how the king had had it on his person, carefully and preciously kept in the pouch around his neck. It seemed impossible that he would give her such a cherished treasure. It was only after much study that my great-great-grandfather was able to decipher the words, the king said, and that is when he realized that the words changed according to the situation at the time. From then on, whenever a king of the city of bright moonlight has had a problem, he consults the paper. And it tells you what to do, Min Li asked. Yes, the king gave a wry smile, though not the way you think. Sometimes the line on the page is more mysterious than the problem. And with that, the king looked down at the line as he read. A startled expression came across his face. What does it say? Min Li asked. It says, the king said slowly, you only lose what you cling to. The king's words seemed to hang in the air. All was silent except for the soft rustling of the page and the gentle breeze. Min Li, unable to speak, watched it flutter as if it were waving at her. So it seems your request, the king said, deserves consideration. The line tells me as much. Let me think. Min Li looked at the king, quiet but puzzled. For generations, my family has prized this paper. We have honored it for its spiritual power and authority. It has been passed on and studied and cherished and revered. It has been valued above gold or jade, the king said slowly. But what is it really? Min Li shook her head, unsure if she should respond. It is actually, the king said, simple proof of my ancestors' rudeness, his unprincipled anger and ruthless greed. Yet we've disregarded that. Instead, we guard and protect this written line so dearly that the rulers of the city of bright moonlight carry it at all times, not daring to let it out of their possession. The moon seemed to tremble as ripples spread over its reflection caught in the water. The king continued again, speaking more to himself than to Min Li. We have clung to it, always afraid of losing it, the king said. But if I choose to release it, there is no loss. Min Li felt her breath freeze in her chest. She knew the king's mind was in a delicate balance. If he refused to give her the line now, she would never get it, and perhaps it was never meant for us to cling to. No matter whom the paper originally belonged to, this is a page from the Book of Fortune, a book that no one owns, the king said. So perhaps it's time for the paper to return to the book. A wind skimmed the water, and Min Li could see her anxious face as pale and as white as the moon reflected on it. You only lose what you cling to, the king repeated to himself. He glanced again at the paper and then looked at Min Li. A serene expression settled on his face, and then he quietly smiled and said, "So, by choosing to give you the line, I do not lose it." And with those words, he placed the paper in Min Lee's trembling hands.